In the span of just 10 days, an entire nation would cease to exist, not erased from maps overnight, but systematically dismantled, its government fleeing into the darkness, its army scattered across muddy fields, its people facing a choice between surrender and annihilation. This is the story of Poland's final moments as an independent state, September 21st through 30th, 1939, when the last echoes of resistance faded and the machinery of occupation began its terrible work. It's a story of courage and desperation, of leadership under impossible circumstances, and of ordinary people confronting extraordinary evil. On September 1st, Hitler's armies had crossed the Polish border in what the world would remember as the opening salvo of World War II. But few realized that the death of a nation would not come in one catastrophic blow. Instead, it would unfold over desperate weeks as Poland's military fought with everything they had against an enemy with overwhelming technological superiority. By September 21st, after 3 weeks of relentless combat, the situation had become clear. Poland could not win. The German war machine was systematically crushing Polish forces with panzer divisions, Stuka dive bombers, and coordinated infantry assaults. But what made these final 10 days uniquely significant was not the battles themselves, though battles raged across the country, but rather the political death of the Polish state, the exodus of its government, and the desperate final stands of soldiers who knew they were fighting not for victory, but for honor. The capital, Warsaw, remained unconquered, but by September 21st, the German army had advanced deep into Polish territory, and on that very day, something even more catastrophic happened. The Soviet Union invaded from the east. This had been secretly agreed upon in the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, a cynical division of spoils that sealed Poland's doom. From 2 directions, west and east, the pincers closed. For Poland's government, this was the moment of final reckoning. Marshal Edward Rydz-Miguel, the commander-in-chief of Polish forces, had made the decision days earlier that the government would flee. On the night of September 17th, the Polish government had already evacuated Warsaw in motor car convoys racing toward the Romanian border. By September 21st, they were in southern Poland, desperately seeking a way out of the country entirely. The decision to flee was controversial. Was it cowardice or strategic necessity? But while the government evacuated, the military situation deteriorated by the hour. The German army, under General Adolf Strauss, was executing a coordinated strategy of encirclement, attempting to trap remaining Polish forces. Poland's military, brave but equipped with outdated weapons and lacking air superiority, was being ground to pieces. Polish cavalry, the romantic symbol of the old Polish army, charged against German tanks with sabers drawn, a tragic image that would become emblematic of Poland's desperate resistance. They never stood a chance. By September 21st, the Polish army had been pushed into smaller pockets, its soldiers fighting rearguard actions to buy time for civilians and officials to escape toward Romania and Hungary. The Modlin fortress, north of Warsaw, was under siege. The fortress commanded the approaches to the capital, and its garrison, commanded by General August Orlik Dreser, fought with fanatical determination against overwhelming odds. The fortress was surrounded by German forces, pounded by artillery and bombed from the air, and yet it held. Day after day, the defenders refused to surrender, even as food ran low and ammunition dwindled. It was a desperate gesture, but also a declaration of Polish national character. We will not go quietly. Around Warsaw itself, the situation was similarly dire. The city, home to over 1 million people, was being gradually surrounded by German forces. General Stefan Dąb-Biernacki, who had assumed command of Warsaw's defenses, knew the city could not be held indefinitely, but he was determined to make the Germans pay for every street, every building. The civilian population was suffering terribly. Refugees from western Poland had poured into Warsaw, swelling the population and straining resources. German bombers came repeatedly, targeting military positions, but inevitably hitting residential areas. The Luftwaffe, which enjoyed complete air superiority, could strike almost at will. In these final 10 days of September, Warsaw was transformed from one of Europe's great capitals into a city under siege, its citizens huddling in cellars and makeshift shelters, uncertain whether the next bomb would be their last. Perhaps nowhere was the desperation of Poland's final days more evident than in the events unfolding along the routes of escape toward Romania and Hungary. Thousands of Polish soldiers, separated from their units, were attempting to flee toward neutral countries where they hoped to regroup and rejoin the fight. The roads toward the borders became crowded with desperate men, soldiers without units, officers without commands, officials fleeing the advancing Red Army. They traveled by whatever means they could, on foot, in borrowed motor cars, sometimes on horseback. The journey was harrowing. German forces were everywhere, and Soviet forces were advancing from the east. There was no safe route. On September 21st, as the government convoy raced toward the border, tragedy struck. The convoys were attacked by German forces, and in the confusion, Marshal Reichsmiguel managed to escape, but the caravan was scattered and key documents left behind. The symbol of Polish state authority was literally fleeing in disarray, and everyone could see it. By September 22nd, the government had crossed into Romania. But this was not a triumphant exile. It was a hunted flight. Polish diplomats and officials were dispersed across Europe, unsure where the next stand would be made. For the soldiers still fighting in Poland, however, there would be no escape. They were trapped. The Vistula River, that great geographic dividing line in Poland, had become a barrier. The German army controlled the bridges, and the Soviet army was approaching from the east. For soldiers in the east, the choice was stark. Be captured by the Germans, be captured by the Soviets, or die fighting. Many chose to fight. The Battle of the Vistula River, which had been fought in the weeks prior, was essentially finished by September 21st. In the center of the country, Polish armies under General Julius Rommel were attempting to hold out, but they too were being pressed back relentlessly. The German 10th Army advanced toward Warsaw from the south, while German forces attacked from north and west. The noose was tightening. In these days, the average Polish soldier must have known that the cause was lost. The Germans had superior numbers, superior equipment, superior air power, and now the Soviets had also invaded. There was no reinforcement coming. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, but they were thousands of miles away and could not help. Poland was alone, and Poland was dying. And yet, soldiers continued to fight. The 7th Infantry Division, under Colonel Stefan Roecki, attempted to organize resistance around Warsaw. General Kutreba, who had briefly achieved a breakthrough in the Battle of Warsaw's suburbs, desperately tried to consolidate his forces for one more coordinated stand. These men were not fighting for victory. They knew victory was impossible. They were fighting for honor, for time, for the chance to extract as many people as possible from the machinery of conquest. In the cities, the civilian population was coming to grips with what occupation would mean. In Warsaw, even as the German army was still outside the walls, people were beginning to understand that their old world was ending. The Jewish population, numbering nearly 400,000 in Warsaw alone, had particular reason for fear, though the full extent of the horrors to come was not yet known. Anti-Semitic violence had always existed in Poland, and many Jews had been fleeing for years as Nazi persecution increased. Now, with the Germans approaching, there was nowhere left to run. Some attempted to flee toward Romania or deeper into the Soviet-occupied zone, hoping that Soviet occupation would be preferable to Nazi rule. They were tragically mistaken. In areas already occupied by German forces, the process of establishing German control was beginning. The SS, the Nazi Party's paramilitary organization, was already operating in Poland, and from the first days of occupation, atrocities were being committed. Polish civilians were being executed, particularly educated elites, clergy, and political leaders. The Germans had explicit plans for Poland: complete subjugation, elimination of leadership, replacement of culture with German dominance. Some Poles who could pass as ethnic Germans were to be absorbed into the Reich. Others were to be enslaved or eliminated. The concept of Polish nationality was to be erased. By September 25th, the military situation had become completely hopeless. The government was in Romania, negotiating to move to France and then Britain. The Soviet army had advanced deep into Poland, occupying the eastern half of the country. The German army was gradually tightening its grip, and Warsaw was now clearly doomed to fall. The question was no longer whether Germany would win, but when, and what would remain of Polish resistance afterward. In Warsaw, General WW2 had perhaps 100,000 soldiers under his command, along with hastily organized civilian militia, but these were faced with German forces vastly superior in numbers and equipment. The Germans had artillery, air power, and tanks. The Polish defenders had rifles, machine guns, and determination. It was a mismatch that could have only one outcome. On September 26th, the German army launched its full assault on Warsaw. Artillery bombardment intensified to a level of fury that few cities had experienced. The Luftwaffe bombed continuously. Parts of the city were set on fire. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The defenders fought desperately to slow the German advance, but they were being pushed back inexorably. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, were dying by the hundreds. The city's hospitals were overwhelmed. The morgues filled. There was no adequate shelter for the million-plus people in the city. On September 27th, the situation had deteriorated to complete catastrophe. The German army had broken through the outer defenses and was fighting in the suburbs. General WW2 requested permission to negotiate a surrender. The negotiations were tense. The Germans offered harsh terms: complete surrender, disarming of all forces, delivery of military equipment. The only mercy was allowing evacuation of some civilians and treating captured soldiers according to international law. It was little comfort, but faced with complete city destruction and the deaths of thousands of civilians, the Polish command felt they had no choice. On September 28th, Polish resistance in Warsaw effectively ended. The defenders fought through the night of September 27th to 28th in a desperate last stand, attempting to extract as many civilians as possible. But morning came, and with it, the reality of defeat. At dawn on September 28th, 1939, Polish forces began laying down their arms. It took hours. Thousands of Polish soldiers marched into captivity. Some would survive the war in German POW camps. Many would not. The Wehrmacht, as it processed these prisoners, was already making calculations about what to do with them. Poland's military had been destroyed. But even as Warsaw fell, Polish soldiers were still fighting elsewhere. In the south, along the San River, and in the mountains near the Slovak border, Polish forces continued to resist. The battle for Lwów, in eastern Poland, was still ongoing. On September 29th, as Warsaw fell and German forces began consolidating control, Polish military units in other parts of the country were beginning to understand the scope of their defeat. The Modlin fortress, north of Warsaw, finally fell on September 28th, after weeks of siege. The garrison there, which had held out against overwhelming odds, surrendered when it became clear that further resistance would only lead to the deaths of thousands of defenders for no strategic advantage. General Orlish Dresser, negotiated a surrender that allowed his men to be treated as prisoners of war rather than executed on the spot. In the southeast, Polish forces continued to fight for a few more days, but the outcome was never in doubt. By September 30th, the last Polish units were either surrounded, surrendering, or fleeing toward the Romanian and Hungarian borders. The military campaign that had begun on September 1st was, for all practical purposes, over. The Polish army, which had fought with remarkable courage against overwhelming odds, had been defeated. The nation's government was in exile. The occupation had begun. What made these final 10 days so historically significant was not just the military defeat. Many nations had been defeated before. But what the defeat meant: Poland was not occupied by a conventional conqueror who would rule but ultimately leave. Poland was occupied by Nazi Germany, which had explicit plans for the total destruction of the Polish nation. The Polish government, Polish leadership, Polish culture, all were targeted for elimination. This was not occupation in the traditional sense. It was a sentence of national death. The horrors that would unfold over the next 6 years. The Holocaust, in which over 90% of Poland's 3 million Jews would be murdered. The deaths of millions of Polish civilians under Nazi rule. The enslavement of entire populations. The attempted cultural genocide. All of this was made possible by the fact that Poland, militarily defeated by September 30th, 1939, could offer no effective resistance. The soldiers who fought in those final 10 days, who charged German tanks with inadequate weapons, who held fortresses against overwhelming bombardment, who refused to surrender until their positions were literally indefensible, did so knowing that they were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for honor. They were fighting to slow the machinery of conquest, to buy time for civilians and government officials to escape, and to ensure that when historians looked back at Poland's defeat, they would not see a nation that surrendered without a fight, but a nation that fought with every ounce of strength it possessed. And that matters. That matters because the legacy of those days, the legacy of Polish resistance even in the face of certain defeat, would echo through the next 6 years of occupation and would help sustain Polish national consciousness even when the nation itself had ceased to exist officially on any map. The Polish Home Army, which would wage a secret war against Nazi occupation throughout the war, drew its inspiration from those days. The Warsaw Uprising in 1944, one of the most famous acts of resistance during World War II, was an attempt by Poles to liberate their own capital, and it, too, drew inspiration from the knowledge that Polish soldiers had fought to the bitter end in 1939. By September 30th, 1939, Poland had fallen, but something in the Polish national spirit had not been conquered. That spirit, born in those desperate final days, would outlast the Nazi occupation. In some ways, Poland's story in these 10 days was the story of World War II in microcosm. The encounter between a totalitarian dictatorship possessed of overwhelming military force and a nation that refused to surrender without a fight. Poland lost militarily, but the war would continue for 6 more years, and eventually, Poland would find itself on the side of the victors. Even though much of its territory would be lost and much of its population would be destroyed. The final chapter of Poland's story in World War II was not written in September 1939, but it began there, in those desperate 10 days when a nation fought for its survival against an enemy that wanted not merely to conquer it, but to erase it from the face of the earth. And that, ultimately, is why these 10 days matter so much to history. They represent the moment when the Second World War, which had begun as a conflict between states, became something far darker, a war of annihilation, a war of ideology, a war in which surrender meant not peace, but enslavement and death. Poland, in those final days of September 1939, learned a lesson that many other European nations would learn in the months and years that followed, that some enemies cannot be appeased, some conflicts cannot be settled through conventional means, and sometimes all you can do is fight, knowing that defeat is certain, and hope that your struggle will be remembered. The story of Poland in the last 10 days of September 1939 is a story of courage, tragedy, and the beginning of one of history's darkest chapters. But it is also a story of human resilience, of national spirit, that cannot be extinguished even when a nation ceases to exist on maps. To understand the true significance of these 10 days, we must recognize that Poland's defeat was not simply a military matter. Yes, the Polish army was defeated. Yes, the government fled into exile. But what happened in those 10 days was the beginning of an entirely new kind of conflict. A conflict not just between nations, but between totalitarian ideology and human dignity itself. The soldiers fighting in Warsaw, in the Modlin fortress, and throughout the countryside knew what they faced. They had seen the newsreels of German treatment of Czechoslovakia. They had heard stories of what Nazi occupation meant. They knew surrender would not lead to peace, but to subjugation, to suppression of their language, their culture, their identity as a people, and yet they fought anyway, for week after week, with inadequate equipment, against overwhelming enemy superiority. They fought knowing the cause was lost, that help was not coming. They fought anyway, and in doing so, they set an example that would inspire resistance movements across Europe for the next 6 years. The image of Polish soldiers charging German tanks on horseback has sometimes been dismissed as futile, but those who dismiss it miss the point. Those cavalry charges were declarations of defiance. They were statements that Poland would not go quietly, that Poles would not accept subjugation without a fight, that the spirit of Polish independence would burn in the hearts of its soldiers, even as the nation fell. That spirit was infectious. It spread through occupied territories. It inspired creation of the Polish Home Army, one of the largest underground resistance movements in Nazi-occupied Europe. It gave courage to Poles who faced impossible choices about collaboration, risk, and maintaining humanity in the face of dehumanization. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944, occurring 5 years after Warsaw's surrender in September 1939, was directly inspired by the memory of this earlier resistance. The Poles who rose up in 1944, fighting in the streets of the same city that had surrendered in 1939, did so because they remembered that Polish soldiers had fought in 1939. They knew that even though the military situation in 1944 was as hopeless as in 1939, they had to fight. They had to fight, because to do otherwise would betray those who had come before. And that is the true significance of Poland's last 10 days in September 1939. It was not just the end of an independent Polish state. It was the beginning of Polish resistance. It was the moment when the Polish people made a choice. They would resist, they would fight, they would endure, and they would survive. That choice, made in September 1939, would sustain the Polish nation through 6 years of Nazi occupation, through the Holocaust, through the deaths of millions, through the Soviet occupation that would follow. The spirit of Polish independence, born in those desperate 10 days when a nation made its last stand, would outlive the Nazi regime, would outlast the Cold War, and would ultimately help bring freedom to Poland and Eastern Europe. The soldiers who fought in those days did not achieve military victory. The fortress commanders who refused to surrender did not save their cities. The government officials who fled did not prevent occupation, but they did something more important. They ensured that historians would see Poland not as defeated, but as defiant. They ensured that the world would remember Poland's refusal to surrender without a fight. They ensured that the Polish people, no matter how brutally the Nazis tried to crush their national identity, would remember who they were. In this sense, Poland's defeat was not a defeat at all. It was a beginning. the beginning of a resistance that proved to be one of the defining features of World War II in Eastern Europe. It was the beginning of a struggle that would not end until the Nazi regime lay in ashes and Poland was liberated. The last 10 days of September 1939 saw the collapse of Poland as a political and military entity. But in those same 10 days, something else was born. A will to resist, a determination to survive, and a commitment to the survival of Polish national identity that would endure for centuries. That is why these 10 days matter. That is why they deserve to be remembered, not as a moment of shame, but as a moment of defining courage in the face of absolute evil. The story of Poland's fall is also the story of Polish resilience, and resilience, ultimately in the end, determines who truly wins in the great historical struggles of our age.